Sandman.
Greetings, friends. We all know that the winter holiday season is one of the brightest times of the year. However, even the brightest side has a dark and frightening shadow. In this video, I will tell you about one mysterious phenomenon from European mythology and folklore, also known as the Wild Hunt. The Wild Hunt is a mythical phenomenon found in European folklore and mythology associated with the winter season, the spirits of the dead, and the old pagan gods. It involves a ghostly or supernatural group of hunters passing in wild pursuit across the skies or along the ground, accompanied by baying hounds and blowing horns. The leader of the hunt is often a named figure associated with Odin in Germanic legends, but may variously be a historical or legendary figure like Theodoric the Great, the Danish king Valdemar Atterdag, the dragon slayer Sigurd, the Welsh psychopomp Gwyn ap Nudd, biblical figures such as Herod, Cain, Gabriel, or the devil, or an unidentified lost soul or spirit, either male or female. The hunters are generally the souls of the dead or ghostly dogs, sometimes fairies, valkyries, or elves. Seeing the wild hunt was thought to forebode some catastrophe such as war or plague, or at best the death of the one who witnessed it. People encountering the hunt might also be abducted to the underworld or the fairy kingdom. In some instances, it was also believed that people's spirits could be pulled away during their sleep to join the cavalcade. There is no one standardized depiction of the wild hunt, but it shares some common traits across various folk versions. It often involves a cacophonous aerial parade of spirits, fairies, or phantoms traveling in groups, frequently mounted and pursuing their prey in furious gallop. They were said to appear after dark, usually in the depths of winter, and were thought to portend catastrophe, conflict, illness, and death. The sounds of barking dogs, cracking whips, rattling chains, and horn blasts typically accompany the spectral hunters rushing through the skies. People encountering the wild hunt were advised to throw themselves face down to the ground to avoid being carried off or having harm befall them as a result of witnessing the forbidden supernatural spectacle. Those mortals who glimpsed the wild hunt were considered marked for death or misfortune thereafter. There are tales of people being rewarded for their courage in facing the hunt, but such instances are rare. The common advice was to hide and stay out of sight until it passed. The concept of the wild hunt was first documented by the German folklorist Jacob Grimm, who first published it in his 1835 book Deutsche Mythology. It was in this work that he popularized the term wild jagd for the phenomenon. Grimm's methodological approach was rooted in the idea, common in 19th century Europe, that modern folklore represented a fossilized survival of the beliefs of the distant past. In developing his idea of the wild hunt, he mixed together recent folkloric sources with textual evidence dating to the medieval and early modern periods. This approach came to be criticized within the field of folkloristics during the 20th century, as more emphasis was placed on the dynamic and evolving nature of folklore. Grimm interpreted the wild hunt phenomenon as having pre-Christian origins, arguing that the male figure who appeared in it was a survival of folk beliefs about the god Woden, who had lost his sociable character, his near-familiar features, and assumed the aspect of a dark and dreadful power, a specter and a devil. Grimm believed that this male figure was sometimes replaced by a female counterpart, whom he referred to as Holda and Berchta. In his words, not only Wotan and other gods, but heathen goddesses too, may head the furious host. The wild hunter passes into the woodwife, Woden into Frau God. He added his opinion that this female figure was Woden's wife. Discussing martial elements of the wild hunt, Grimm commented that it marches as an army, it portends the outbreak of war. He added that a number of figures that had been recorded as leading the hunt, such as Wotan, Huckelbernd, Berholt, bestriding their white warhorse, armed and spurred, appear still as supreme directors of the war for which they, so to speak, give license to mankind. Grimm believed that in pre-Christian Europe, the hunt, led by a god and a goddess, either visited the land at some holy tide, bringing welfare and blessing, accepting gifts and offerings of the people, or they alternately float, unseen through the air, perceptible in cloudy shapes, in the roar and howl of the winds, carrying on war, hunting, or the game of ninepins, the chief employments of ancient heroes, an array which, less tied down to a definite time, explains more the natural phenomenon. He believed that under the influence of Christianization, the story was converted from being that of a solemn march of gods, to being a pack of horrid specters, dashed with dark and devilish ingredients. A little earlier, in 1823, Felicia Hemans records this legend in her poem The Wild Huntsman, linking it here specifically to the castles of Rodenstein and Schnellertz, and to the Odenwald. In the influential book Kultische Geheimbund der Germanen, Otto Hoffler argued that the German motifs of the Wild Hunt should be interpreted as the spectral troops led by the god Wotan, which had a ritualistic counterpart in the living bands of ecstatic warriors, Old Norse berserker, allegedly in a cultic union with the dead warriors of the past. Hans-Peter Dewar noted that for modern readers, it is generally difficult to decide, on the basis of the sources, whether what is involved in the reports about the appearance of the Wild Hunt is merely a demonic interpretation of natural phenomenon, or whether we are dealing with a description of ritual processions of humans changed into demons. Historian Ronald Hutton noted that there was a powerful and well-established international scholarly tradition which argued that the medieval Wild Hunt legends were an influence on the development of the early modern ideas of the witch's Sabbath. Hutton nevertheless believed that this approach could be fundamentally challenged. An abundance of different tales of the Wild Hunt has been recorded in Germany. The leader, often called der Skimmelreiter, is generally identified with the god Wotan, but sometimes with a feminine figure, the wife of Wotan, Holda, the friendly one, also Holly or Holt, Fru War, or Frugode in northern Germany, or Perkta, the bright one, also Berchta, Berta or Berta, in southern Germany. The leader also is sometimes an undead noble, most often called Count Hackelberg or Count Ebernberg, who is cursed to hunt eternally because of misbehavior during his lifetime, and in some versions died from injuries of a slain boar's tusk. Dogs and wolves were generally involved. In some areas, werewolves were depicted as stealing beer and sometimes food in houses. Horses were portrayed as 2, 3, 6, and 8-legged, often with fiery eyes. In the host variants, principally found in southern Germany, a man went out in front, warning people to get out of the streets before the coming of the host's armed men, who were sometimes depicted as doing battle with one another. A feature peculiar to the hunt version, generally encountered in northern Germany, was the pursuit and capture of one or more female demons, or a hart in some versions, while some others did not have prey at all. Sometimes, the tales associate the hunter with a dragon or the devil. The lone hunter, der Wildjäger, is most often riding a horse, seldom a horse-drawn carriage, and usually has several hounds in his company. If the prey is mentioned, it is most often a young woman, either guilty or innocent. Gottfried August Berger's ballad Der Wildjäger describes the fate of a nobleman who dares to hunt on the Sabbath and finds both a curse and a pack of demons deep in the woods. He might also have asked God to let him hunt until Judgment Day, as has Ewiger Jäger, the eternal hunter. The majority of the tales deal with some person encountering the wild hunt. If this person stands up against the hunters, he will be punished. If he helps the hunt, he will be awarded money, gold, or, most often, a leg of a slain animal or human, which is often cursed in a way that makes it impossible to be rid of it. In this case, the person has to find a priest or magician able to ban it or trick the wild hunt into taking the leg back by asking for salt, which the hunt cannot deliver. In many versions, a person staying right in the middle of the road during the encounter is safe. In Scandinavia, the leader of the hunt was Odin, and the event was referred to as Odin's Jakt, Odin's Hunt, and Askoria, from Asgardsrian, the Asgard Ride. Odin's hunt was heard but rarely seen, and a typical trait is that one of Odin's dogs was barking louder and a second one fainter. Besides one or two shots, these barks were the only sounds that were clearly identified. When Odin's hunt was heard, it meant changing weather in many regions, but it could also mean war and unrest. According to some reports, the forest turned silent and only a whining sound and dog barks could be heard. In western Sweden and sometimes in the east as well, it has been said that Odin was a nobleman or even a king who had hunted on Sundays and therefore was doomed to hunt down and kill supernatural beings until the end of time. According to certain accounts, Odin does not ride, but travels in a wheeled vehicle, specifically a one-wheeled cart. In parts of Smaland, it appears that people believed that Odin hunted with large birds when the dogs got tired. When it was needed, he could transform a bevy of sparrows into an armed host. If houses were built on former roads, they could be burnt down, because Odin did not change his plans if he had formerly traveled on a road there. Not even charcoal kilns could be built on disused roads, because if Odin was hunting the kiln would be ablaze. One tradition maintains that Odin did not travel further up than an ox wears his yoke, so if Odin was hunting, it was safest to throw oneself onto the ground in order to avoid being hit, a porkboy story that evolved as an explanation for the popular belief that persons lying at ground level are safer from lightning strikes than are persons who are standing. In Algolt in Smaland, it was safest to carry a piece of bread and a piece of steel when going to church and back during Yule. The reason was that if one met the rider with the broad-rimmed hat, one should throw the piece of steel in front of oneself, but if one met his dogs first, one should throw the pieces of bread instead. In the Peterborough Chronicle, there is an account of the wild hunt's appearance at night, beginning with the appointment of a disastrous abbot for the monastery, Henry d'Angely, in 1127. Many men both saw and heard a great number of huntsmen hunting. The huntsmen were black, huge, and hideous, and rode on black horses and on black he-goats, and their hounds were jet black, with eyes like saucers, and horrible. This was seen in the very deer park of the town of Peterborough, and in all the woods that stretch from that same town to Stamford, and in the night the monks heard them sounding and winding their horns. Reliable witnesses were said to have given the number of huntsmen as 20 or 30, and it is said, in effect, that this went on for 9 weeks, ending at Easter. Ord Eric Vitalis, an English monk cloistered at Saint-Evroul-sur-Ouche, in Normandy, reported a similar cavalcade seen in January 1091, which he said were Herlikin's troop. While these earlier reports of wild hunts were recorded by clerics and portrayed as diabolic, in late medieval romances, such as Sir Orfeo, the hunters are rather from a fairy otherworld, where the wild hunt was the hosting of the fairies. Its leaders also varied, but they included Gwydion, Gwyn ap Nudd, King Arthur, Nuada, King Herla, Woden, the Devil and Herne the Hunter. Many legends are told of their origins, as in that of Dando and his dogs, or the Dandy Dogs. Dando, wanting a drink but having exhausted what his huntsmen carried, declared he would go to hell for it. A stranger came and offered a drink, only to steal Dando's game and then Dando himself, with his dogs giving chase. The sight was long claimed to have been seen in the area. Another legend recounted how King Herla, having visited the fairy king, was warned not to step down from his horse until the greyhound he carried jumped down. He found that 3 centuries had passed during his visit, and those of his men who dismounted crumbled to dust. He and his men are still riding, because the greyhound has yet to jump down. The myth of the wild hunt has through the ages been modified to accommodate other gods and folk heroes, among them King Arthur and, more recently, in a Dartmoor folk legend, Sir Francis Drake. At Cadbury Castle in Somerset, an old lane near the castle was called King Arthur's Lane, and even in the 19th century, the idea survived that on wild winter nights the king and his hounds could be heard rushing along with it. In certain parts of Britain, the hunt is said to be that of hellhounds chasing sinners or the unbaptized. In Devon these are known as Yeth, Heath, or wished hounds, in Cornwall Dando and his dogs or the Devil and his dandy dogs, in Wales the CWN and the Hounds of Hell, and in Somerset as Gabriel Ratchets or Wretchets. In Devon the hunt is particularly associated with Wistman's Wood. There are many locales notorious for frequent sightings of the spectral hunt across Europe. Particular mountains, roads, and bodies of water served as popular haunts or crossing points for the host. Examples include the Peak District in northern England, Peterborough Abbey, and sites across Lincolnshire and Yorkshire. The wild hunt was also known to cross large lakes and sea inlets from Wales to Denmark. Certain natural phenomena may have influenced and shaped the common depiction of the wild hunt over the ages. Spectacular visible northern lights displays, frightening storms, high winds, and odd animal behaviors all seem to signal or accompany its dreaded passage through the skies. Migrating birds moving in huge numbers at night, especially in autumn and winter, may have suggested phantom riders rushing by. Sounds of natural spirits at a distance could resemble the baying of hounds and blowing of horns. From region to region, the omens believed to be carried by sightings of the wild hunt have varied somewhat over time, but were almost always considered ominous. Folk believed them to portend a bad growing season, poor harvests, outbreaks of disease, personal danger and death for individuals soon after witnessing the spectacle. Less often, the wild hunt foretold climactic change and unstable weather. Positive omens associated with seeing the hunt were very uncommon across the different traditions. Over the long centuries, various rituals, charms, and wards developed across the continent seeking to defend from or appease the restless, terrifying spirits. Shielding uncovered mirrors, wearing clothes backwards, wearing iron chains around the waist, placing rowan sprigs above doors, carrying steel or stone arrowheads, and reciting special prayers were just some of the protective countermeasures used against them. Berries, porridge, bread and ale were sometimes left outside as offerings for the host. In a scattering of tales, people bonded to the wild hunt for a time before being freed or escaping. The unfortunate individuals carried off by the hunters usually died, went missing permanently, or emerged unhinged, haunted and strange until death. Those stealing from or somehow disrespecting the spectral host might suffer loss of wit, illness, or death. On very rare occasions, the living might join and ride with the hunt for a night and engage in dark supernatural mischief or mayhem across the land side by side with the spirits. Curiously, the wild hunt phenomena seems to have died out across much of Europe since the early 20th century. Once a widely feared and cited country legend, today it remains vivid mainly in Scandinavia and a few isolated pockets of Old World folk tradition in rural eastern Germany, Switzerland, and the British Isles. Some modern esotericists have theorized the wild hunt has withdrawn from mankind's earthly plane due to increasing urbanization, skepticism, and deforestation. Much of its sacred ground and old crossing points have vanished under development over time. For a spectral horde so associated with dense ancient woodlands, remote back roads, and wild heath, this steady erasure of its liminal landscape may partly explain why encounters are now so rare. There have been a spattering of alleged wild hunt apparitions in recent decades, but most have occurred in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Germany, where belief remains somewhat stronger and patches of authentic wilderness linger. Whether the sacred riders will someday burst forth and reclaim more of their traditional haunts as humanity's faith wavers remains to be seen. For now, the once near universal terror of the furious host overshadowing entire societies has faded mostly into whispered legend. Its pounding hooves still echo faintly, however, down the ages and across certain hidden soul-touched places in the old world where elder gods and spirits of a pagan long ago still dwell.